The laughter was immediate and careless. Adaeze heard it land around her like stones dropped into water. She heard, distinctly, the voice of Chisholm, who sat in the third row, who wore the kind of expensive braids that came from salons with AC, say to her neighbor, loud enough to be heard, "Market girl." Adaeze looked at Chisholm then. Just looked. Directly, without flinching, without anger, which was somehow more unsettling than anger would have been. Chisholm looked away first. She stood in the hard morning light and felt something shift. Not joy, exactly, but a deep, structural satisfaction, the feeling of having placed a load precisely where you intended it to go. She was crying, she realized, only because her vision had blurred. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, noted it without judgment, and took out the notebook from the nylon bag. She wrote the grades down. She wrote the date. Then she wrote, in the margin, in her own handwriting, "The story is not finished." Before we begin, if you love stories that will shake your heart and change how you see people, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications. Drop a comment below and tell us where you are watching from and your local time. Now, let us get into this story, because what you are about to see, nobody saw it coming. The room smelled of onions and old rain. It was the kind of smell that gets into fabric, into hair, into the small cracks of a childhood, the kind you only notice when you have been away and come back. But Adaeze had never been away. She had lived her whole 17 years in that single room in the belly of Port Harcourt, where the walls were the color of old teeth, and the ceiling fan worked only when it felt like it, which was rarely, and the world outside the window moved with a noise and urgency that seemed to belong to a different story than the one she was living. She was brilliant. Not in the way that teachers announce at prize-giving ceremonies. Not that kind, not yet, but in the quieter, more dangerous way. The kind of brilliant that observes everything. That calculates. That takes apart the engine of a situation and sees, without being taught, exactly which part is broken and why. This gift had not yet made her money. It had not yet made her safe. It had, so far, made her the girl who fixed the neighbor's generator when the mechanic charged too much, and who helped Mama Grace manage what little they had so that it stretched further than it had any right to. It was not enough. It was never quite enough. The fee notice came on a Tuesday. 18,500 naira. Second term payment. Deadline, 2 weeks. Adaeze read it twice, not because she misunderstood it, but because she was doing the arithmetic of their lives in her head, running the numbers the way she always did, looking for a path through the mathematics of impossibility. There was 1,850 naira in the tin beneath the mattress. There was the 600 naira that Mama Grace would earn mending clothes before the deadline. There was nothing else. Her mother was at the window when she got home, needle moving steadily through the collar of someone else's shirt, her hands doing the work that her face refused to show. Mama Grace was a beautiful woman who had learned to wear stillness like armor. She had been wearing it since the day Adeeze's father packed a bag and left it somewhere on the road between Port Harcourt and Lagos and never came back. Adaeze put the paper on the stool between them. Her mother's needle paused. Just for a second. Then it continued. "How much do we have?" Adaeze asked, though she already knew. Mama Grace told her. The number sat in the room between them like something neither of them wanted to touch. That night Adaeze lay awake and stared at the ceiling and listened to the city and thought. She was always thinking. It was the thing she could not stop, could not turn off, not even in the heaviest hours of the night. Her mind moved over problems the way hands move over a familiar surface in the dark, testing, measuring, finding edges. By 2 in the morning, she had a plan. It was not a comfortable plan, but it was a plan. She did not know that the next morning would change something in her permanently. Mrs. Ifeoma was the commerce teacher, a woman who wore her disappointment in the posture of someone bracing for impact at all times. When she entered the classroom that morning and opened the register, there was a specific silence, the silence of students who knew what was coming, some with dread and some with the dull relief of those who had already paid. Students with outstanding fees will stand. Adaeze stood. She did it quickly, before she could let hesitation make it worse, the way you remove a plaster in one motion. She was one of 5. She stood with her back straight and her face composed, and she looked not at Mrs. Ifeoma but at the window, at the slice of sky visible above the school compound wall. "I have spoken to your parents," Mrs. Ifeoma said, her voice carrying across the room with the ease of someone accustomed to addressing people who cannot leave. "There is a limit to what a school can absorb. If you cannot meet the requirements—" She paused in the way that people pause when they want a word to land. "Perhaps the market is a more appropriate environment." The laughter was immediate and careless. Adaeze heard it land around her like stones dropped into water. She heard, distinctly, the voice of Chisholm, who sat in the 3rd row, who wore the kind of expensive braids that came from salons with AC, say to her neighbor, loud enough to be heard, "Market girl." Adaeze looked at Chisholm then. Just looked. Directly, without flinching, without anger, which was somehow more unsettling than anger would have been. Chisholm looked away first. Adaeze sat back down. She had already decided. The market. Fine. The market it was. She went to Mama Chidinma first, a groundnut oil seller on the edge of Rumula Market, a stout and permanently suspicious woman who had known Adaeze since she was small and occasionally gave her mandatsi on credit. "I want to sell for you," Adaeze said. "I'll take your goods deeper into the residential streets, the ones you can't reach from your stall. I'll keep careful record of every transaction. At the end of each day, I bring you what you're owed and keep a small margin." Mama Chidinma squinted at her. "You're a secondary school girl." "Yes. Your mother knows. She will." A long pause. Then, "Come back tomorrow morning. I'll have a basket ready." The first morning, Adaeze balanced the tray of packaged groundnut oil sachets on her head and walked into the maze of streets behind the market with a notebook in her left hand and a route already mapped in her mind. She had studied the neighborhood the previous afternoon. She knew which streets had morning traffic. She knew where the women cooked early. She knew, from years of walking these streets, which households ran out of oil on which days. It worked. Not completely. Not without friction. There were women who turned her away, men who gave her suspicious looks, a gateman at a compound who told her, with a particular kind of pleasure, that hawkers were not permitted. But she was not selling the way people expected her to sell. She was not calling out from the street and hoping. She was walking up to doors and saying, specifically, "I saw that you bought 1 sachet from Mama Chidinma's stall last Thursday. I have 2 sachets here and I can come every Thursday so you never run out." It was specific. It was useful. People are harder to refuse when they feel seen. On the 4th day, it happened. She was cutting through the wider street near the junction, tray balanced, notebook tucked under her arm, when she heard it, a burst of laughter, and then a phone camera clicking. Chisholm and 2 others from her class were coming out of a cold drinks shop, phones already raised. Chisholm said something to the group that made them laugh again. One of the boys made a gesture towards the tray on Adaeze's head with the loose, theatrical cruelty of a teenager who has never needed to be careful. Adaeze stopped walking. She turned to face them fully. The laughter faltered, very slightly, at the directness of it. She said, clearly, without raising her voice, "When you post that video, make sure you tag the location. I want people to know where to find me." Then she turned around and kept walking. She heard, behind her, a silence that was better than any response she could have given. There were harder days than that one. There was the afternoon a woman's gate swung open and the compound dog got out and scattered her tray across the tarmac, sachets bursting on the road, oil spreading in a slow amber disaster. She knelt in the street and picked up what could be salvaged and counted the loss in her notebook with the precision of someone who cannot afford the luxury of just being upset. Then she calculated what she still had, adjusted the route, and kept going. There was the evening it rained, that sudden total Port Harcourt rain that doesn't warn you, and she ran with the remaining sachets tucked under her arms, her uniform soaked through in under a minute, water running into her shoes, and she arrived home to find the roof leaking again and her mother sitting with a pot beneath the drip, watching the water collect. Mama Grace looked up and saw her daughter, soaked, tray empty, notebook waterproof, wrapped in a black nylon bag that Adaeze had started carrying specifically for this purpose. "Adaeze, I sold everything," Adaeze said. She put the money, wrapped in the nylon, on the stool. Her mother looked at it. Then she looked at her daughter. And she did something Adaeze had not seen her do in a long time. She laughed. Not from happiness, exactly. From the particular, defiant joy of being still standing. The collapse, when it came, surprised her. She had thought she was past it. She had thought that the hardening she had felt since Mrs. Ifeoma's classroom was permanent, that she had become the kind of person who did not go down. But bodies are not made of decisions alone. It was a Thursday, 6 weeks in. She had been awake since 4:30. She had not eaten properly. The morning heat was already dense and serious by 8 o'clock when she set out, and by 11 she could feel something happening behind her eyes that was not right. She made it to the edge of a gyp road before her knees went. She sat down on the low wall beside the road and put the tray beside her and put her head in her hands and stayed there. Around her the city continued its noisy commerce, its buses and its arguing and its radical indifference. Nobody stopped. Except one. She was old, genuinely old, the kind of old that has its own gravity, that makes the space around it quieter. She was selling fried akara from a tray of her own, moving slowly in the heat. She stopped in front of Adaeze and did not say anything immediately. She just stood there, looking at the girl with the attention of someone who has seen a great deal and knows the difference between tired and broken. She held out a piece of akara wrapped in newspaper. A sachet of water. Adaeze looked up. The old woman's face was not pitying. It was something better than that. Something that acknowledged the difficulty without making it larger than it was. She said simply, "The road is not finished yet. Keep walking." Then she moved on, tray balanced, feet steady in the heat, her own road continuing. Adaeze sat with the food in her hands for a long time. Then she ate. Then she picked up the tray, stood up, and walked back into the city. The WAEC results went up in July. She did not go early. She arrived mid-morning, when the crowd had thinned and the most dramatic reactions had already happened, and she moved to the board with the calm efficiency she had been practicing since long before she understood what she was practicing it for. Her name. Her number. 7 distinctions. She stood in the hard morning light and felt something shift. Not joy, exactly, but a deep, structural satisfaction, the feeling of having placed a load precisely where you intended it to go. She was crying, she realized, only because her vision had blurred. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, noted it without judgment, and took out the notebook from the nylon bag. She wrote the grades down. She wrote the date. Then she wrote, in the margin, in her own handwriting, "The story is not finished." What followed was not easy to compress into a summary, because it was not a summary. It was years of specific, unglamorous effort, a national diploma at the Polytechnic, earned on a partial scholarship and supplemented by a business she had been quietly building since secondary school, a supply chain service for small traders, the natural extension of everything she had observed while walking those residential streets with a tray on her head. She had understood something that day, that first day selling oil. The problem was not that people didn't want to buy. The problem was that the goods weren't where the people were, and the people who moved the goods had no system. They relied on memory, habit, social ties. Everything was informal, everything was lossy. There was an enormous amount of money disappearing between producer and consumer, not into anyone's pocket but into the gap of pure inefficiency. She built a system. She started with a notebook and a bicycle and 3 traders who trusted her. She moved to a spreadsheet, then a basic digital tool she had coded herself after teaching herself programming at the Polytechnic's computer lab between 8 and 10 p.m. on the nights when the lab was open. She recruited 2 friends. Then 6. Then 20. By 30 she ran a company. The Lagos office was on the 14th floor of a building on Victoria Island, glass-fronted, full of people who had come to her with certificates and people who had come with nothing and the hunger to learn, and she had looked at both with the same eyes. She had a rule, written nowhere, understood everywhere. Nobody got dismissed for the kind of failure that comes from trying. You only got dismissed for the failure that comes from not caring. The day Chisholm came, it was a Wednesday. She was announced as a referral, recommended by a mutual contact, applying for a senior position in the growth division. The assistant brought the file to Adaeze's office with a note that the candidate had been waiting 20 minutes and seemed nervous. Adaeze looked at the name on the file. She looked at it for a moment. Then she said, "Send her in." Chisholm entered. She was polished, professional, the kind of composed that takes effort to maintain. She had the CV of someone who had done well, good schools, solid positions, the trajectory of a person for whom the beginning had been easier than most. She sat across from Adaeze and smiled and introduced herself and began her prepared speech about her experience and her vision and what she could offer. Then she looked at the woman across the desk. Really looked. The silence that followed was total. It lasted perhaps 5 seconds, perhaps 10. Chisholm's face moved through something, recognition, and then the specific, unwelcome vertigo of understanding exactly who this was and what she had said in a street in Port Harcourt while pointing a phone at a girl with a tray of oil sachets on her head. "Adaeze," she began. Adaeze raised one hand. Not aggressively. Just, "Wait." "I know," she said. She said it without performance. "I remember the junction. I remember what you said. I remember the phone." She paused. "I also remember that you were 17 and that being 17 is its own kind of poverty, a poverty of understanding. Most of us survive it." She leaned forward slightly. "The question I'm more interested in is what you've understood since then." Chisholm looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, quietly, "That I was wrong. That I looked at you and saw a limit instead of a beginning. And I've thought about it more than you probably imagine." Adaeze studied her. This was the skill she had developed since that first classroom. Not bitterness, which costs the bearer more than anyone else, but discernment. The ability to look at a person and ask, "Who are you, actually, and what have you learned from what you've been through?" She saw, in Chisholm's face, something genuine. Something that had cost her to say. She picked up the application. She opened it. "Tell me about your last project," she said. "Specifically, what you would have done differently." She spoke at a conference in Abuja the following year, a gathering of young entrepreneurs, the kind of event she had once watched on a grainy YouTube video in the Polytechnic Computer Lab after everyone else had left. She stood on a stage in front of 400 people and was given a microphone and 15 minutes, and she used them. She told them about the room that smelled of onions and old rain. She told them about Mrs. Ifeoma's classroom, about the coins scattered on the tarmac, about the dog and the oil and the road in the rain. She told them about the old woman with the akara and 4 words that she had been carrying for over a decade. She told them, "I am not asking you to be grateful for hardship. Hardship is not a gift. It is a tax, and it falls unfairly, and we should be honest about that. But I am asking you to refuse to let it be the final word. Because here is what I learned on those streets. The story rewrites itself not in the grand moments, not in the certificate, not in the office, not on this stage, but in the small, private decisions. The decision to pick up the coins. The decision to stand up after the road takes you down. The decision to keep walking when you do not yet know where the road goes." She paused. "Somewhere right now," she said, "there is a girl selling something she didn't plan to sell, in a heat she didn't plan to endure, being laughed at by people who cannot yet see what they are looking at. I want to say to her, from this stage, what an old woman once said to me by the side of a road in Port Harcourt. She looked out at the room. The road is not finished yet. Keep walking. The girl you overlook today may be the one who builds the room you one day walk into. Look carefully. Be kind early. You never know whose story you are standing inside. Every story needs a witness. Thank you for being this one's. See you in the next story. God bless you.